Pantsing or discovery writing is a great approach where you essentially develop the story as you write. You might have a few ideas of what you want to achieve with the story, but for the most part, you make it up as you go, which has serious advantages. For one, you're able to feel the beats in the narrative in real time and able to make on-the-fly adjustments as you go through. Sometimes it's not until you're deep into the writing trenches that you have your strongest ideas. Plus, since you're not bound to a plot outline, you have the freedom to explore strong elements and discard the weakest parts of your story. However, pantsing is more difficult than it sounds. You have so much freedom, sometimes it's difficult to focus and channel your thoughts to the page. Without a clear direction, it can be easy to develop writer's block. So keep in mind that this video isn't intended to be comprehensive. The video's intent is to give you a solid foundation and a general template to follow while pantsing. This advice can aid you in working out trouble spots and can help you prioritize the correct things. As with all writing advice, this is what works for me. Pick and choose what works for you. So before you pants the story, you most likely have some elements already figured out. Like, you probably already know the characters and what they're like. You most likely already know the genre and the tone and probably the basic premise of the story. But there's one other thing that you should have hammered out before you start, and that is designing the main conflict. So you might be thinking, why should I have to plan out the wants? I'm pantsing the story. Isn't the point of pantsing not to spend time planning? And that is true, but I'd argue that by fleshing out the character's wants, you're not plotting. What you're doing is you're setting up the initial conditions of the story in such a way that you have the greatest chance of success later. To determine the main conflict, you must first define the wants of the protagonist and determine how this is directly opposed. If you have an antagonist, then you must ensure the wants of the antagonist directly conflict against the wants of the protagonist. Otherwise, the story will suffer. Now, this sounds obvious, but it's amazing how easily this detail can be missed. For example, superhero movies tend to be bad at this, where the wants don't quite align and require a lot of band-aids to get the story off the ground. So Ant-Man is a great example of this can go wrong. Spoilers ahead. So let's look at 4 characters and see what they want. Scott, the protagonist, wants to have a presence in his daughter's life. That's his main want. Hank doesn't want the shrinking technology to be developed and sold off because it would be dangerous to the world. His want is to hide the technology for as long as he lives. Hope is supportive of her father and has the same wants. Cross wants the technology so he can be powerful and rich. He is the antagonist. The problem with the main conflict in this movie is that Scott's wants don't conflict against Cross's wants, which is unusual because Scott is the main driver behind the plot. The issue with this is that Scott has no emotional stakes in the conflict. Scott's biggest concern is reuniting with his daughter. This is a problem because Scott doesn't care about stopping Cross, so we're really not that invested either. The movie tries to salvage this by justifying that if Scott does stop Cross, then Scott will be able to see his daughter again, but this still isn't very effective because the logic isn't clear. If anything, breaking the law and getting into death-defying situations would achieve the opposite of Scott's goals, so this also introduces plot holes. Then you might think, well, Hope and Hank's wants do directly conflict with Cross's wants. And that's true, but what's weird is that the characters do not act according to these goals because Hope is already a skilled fighter and she's knowledgeable about Cross and his organization and can wear the suit effectively. It would make so much more sense for her to be the protagonist. Instead, the movie needs Scott to be the protagonist, so we're shown lots of scenes that will attempt to justify why this needs to happen, but the justification is weak. All these problems would be resolved if, from the beginning, the wants were aligned perfectly. By not having the wants aligned in the first place, several systemic problems are introduced. Number 1, the audience isn't invested in the main conflict, because Scott doesn't care about the outcome. All he truly wants is to be with his daughter, and the justification used to connect Scott's wants to the main conflict is weak. And it's not clear how defeating Cross will help Scott reunite with his daughter. Basically, why should we care about stopping the bad guy when Scott doesn't even care? Number 2, the story drags. Since the wants are not directly opposed, the story requires explanation to justify why the plot should exist. Since Scott doesn't care about stopping Cross, the story has to provide justification for why he needs to take lead as protagonist. Number 3, the characters are weaker because Hank and Hope have to behave in ways that don't support their wants. They have to do things that don't align with their goals, which make them weaker as characters. There are parts of the story where it attempts to justify this behavior, but in my opinion, it's just a contrivance to force Scott to be the protagonist. And number 4, there are plot holes, again because Scott, Hank, and Hope are behaving in ways that don't make sense. The actions feel contrived and forced, opening the story up to plot holes. Like I said, what Scott cares about is seeing his daughter, so why is he risking his life for a cause that's completely unrelated that he isn't emotionally invested in? Keep in mind, this is just an example of what can go wrong if the wants are not directly conflicting. There are so many other systemic ways that a story can fail if you don't have the main conflict established. Try to think of pantsing like playing chess. In a chess match, the wants are always directly opposed. Both players want to capture the other's king. So even though you don't know how the game will play out, it's exciting because of the direct conflict. So the same applies to writing. Make sure the wants between the antagonist and the protagonist are directly opposed. Otherwise, it will be difficult to justify the story's existence and make into an enjoyable read. Okay, great. So by this point, you're ready to get writing and see how the story plays out. And here's some advice I have for while you're writing. Advice number 1, write in layers. So I love this technique because it has effectively destroyed my writer's block. The reason writer's block commonly occurs, at least for me, is because I'm so thoroughly overwhelmed with all the story components I have to deal with all at once. There's the base level components like wants, needs, motivations, stakes, and character arcs. Then there's the scene level components like tone, pacing, rhythm, dialogue, and conflict. Then there's inline level like grammar, sentence structure, description, clarity, and introspection. So when I pants a scene, I pretty much go level by level. I start off by defining my base. Okay, what are the characters in the scene? What do they want? What are their arcs? What's at stake? So I define that and fill it in. You might not need to do this already if you have the characters and their wants mastered, but sometimes it's good to just touch base so your characters are consistent and rooted. So when I complete this level, I have a general idea what the conflict in the scene will be and what will happen. Now, when I reach the next level, this is where I want to root myself into the characters and let them flow. At this level, I want to feel the story's rhythm and capture the dialogue as best as I can. Here, all I care about is the conflict, dialogue, general placement, and setting. Just think of it as like writing a screenplay. So don't worry about descriptions or showing any emotions just yet, save that for later. Instead, just put placeholders for descriptions or introspection, or give yourself permission to write really lousy. For right now, at this level, just focus on being in the moment of the story, slip into your characters and get a feel for the scene. Write out the dialogue and let the characters flow here. So after you finish this level, you essentially have the screenplay version of the scene, but you want to go through and focus on the inline stuff. Add the descriptions and introspection, use show don't tell, check if your sentences are clear, concise, and grammatically correct to the best of your ability. So when you complete this third level, you should have a nicely written scene that feels focused, but it's also visceral and inspired. So advice number 2, when you're stuck, always go back to the wants and the motivations. Let's say you're writing a scene, but you keep feeling stuck, just something isn't working and you're not sure what. In these situations, always go back to the wants and the motivations of your characters and think how they would realistically act in this situation. Many times the reason why you feel stuck is because you're trying to make X thing happen for the future and you have to force a series of events to get that thing to happen. But don't approach storytelling this way, always use the wants and the motivations of your characters as your guide. If you're unsure, try asking yourself these questions. Are the characters acting in believable ways to achieve their wants? Are there easier ways for these characters to achieve these wants? Is it possible for all the characters to get what they want? If so, then what's the conflict? Are the characters justified in wanting the goals that they set for themselves? Do you have to come up with long and winded explanations for why certain characters have to want certain things in a certain way? Advice number 3, don't get distracted by cool scenes. Let's say you're writing your story and you have a really cool idea for a scene later on. So to include that scene, you have to have certain things happen a certain way. Maybe you need character A to do some random thing and character B to say this, but not mention this, and so on. So what you're doing without realizing it is that you're prioritizing the story over the integrity of your characters, which you never want to do. I know it's tempting because you have this cool scene idea and you want to include it in your story, and in your mind it is really cool, but I guarantee you 95% of the time that scene isn't going to play out nearly as cool as you think it will. Because when the character's wants and motivations are secondary, the moments will not feel earned. So even though you have this cool scene, you didn't earn that moment because you had to use contrivances and force the characters to do a sequence of things to make that happen. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying cool scene ideas are bad as long as it's organic to the narrative and it aligns with the goals and motivations of the characters in a realistic, organic way, then it's great. But what you don't want to do is centralize the story around the goal of achieving that scene. So many times we get obsessed about having a certain scenes in our book and we do everything we can in order to make that scene happen. But the problem with doing that is that you're letting the scenes control your characters, and that's not how storytelling works. It's your characters that need to dictate what happens in your story. Your characters are the ones who need to be in control. So for reference, listen to what Vince Gilligan says here about writing for Breaking Bad.
The trick is to stay honest. I mean, we often have ideas for scenes we'd like to do. And every now and then we have a bad afternoon where we get a little lazy and we say, tell you what, let's hey, we just need a little bit of shoe leather to get us from point A to point B so we can get to this real fun scene that we want to do. And then hopefully more often than not, we stop ourselves. And so I'd like to say it's always me who stops the flow, but sometimes it's some of my writers who work for me who are honest on days where I'm being, a little morally weak, being strong when I'm being a little morally weak, and they say, how would Walt ever do this? How would Skylar ever do that? And we've thrown away some really good scenes that we would truly have loved to have done.
Please keep the following in mind. Cool scenes are cheap. If you stay true to the characters, the cool scenes will reveal themselves on their own, and most importantly, they will feel earned. It is so much better to have an okay scene that is earned than a cool scene that isn't earned. Now, if you follow my advice and you're still having trouble creating cool scenes organically in the story, then most likely what you have to do is flesh out your characters and world into deeper levels. Come up with more nuanced and interesting premises could also help, because if your characters and world are flat with very little conflict, then it will be very difficult for you to organically discover these cool scenes as you go. And lastly, number 4 is listen to your gut. As someone who has beta read hundreds of stories, I constantly see new writers start a book that they're really passionate about, and then halfway through they give it up. It happens all the time, and most likely it will happen to you. You get to the point where you're just not feeling it, and all your motivation is gone. With writers, it's very common to lose interest in your own story. You might as well accept the reality it will happen to you. But when you do lose interest, do not see that as a failure. Instead, interpret that as a diagnostic tool, which is telling you that something in your story is not working. The reason why you get discouraged could be for many reasons, but many of the reasons could simply be there's an issue with the story and your gut is feeling it intuitively. At this point, it is up to you to reflect and root cause why exactly your story isn't working. Maybe the plot is too contrived, or maybe you haven't raised the stakes in a long time. Maybe your main character doesn't have a clear drive to reach their goal. And personally, I experience this a lot. All the time, I get discouraged about my own story, but instead of trudging forward or quitting, I ask myself, why am I discouraged? It forces me to dig deep into the story and the issues I'm having. Then once I figure out what's wrong with the story and I fix it, I usually find that my motivation has returned and I will feel excited to keep writing. My point is, don't get discouraged if you start to feel discouraged. Accept the reality that you will eventually feel this way. It's natural, so when you start to feel like you're trudging through your book, really dig deep and ask yourself why. So that's my overall method when it comes to pantsing. As with all writing advice, pick and choose what works for you. What works for me might not work for you, and that's okay. That's the beauty of writing. All approaches are valid. The best approach is what fits you and your style. Thank you.